My husband drugged me at 9 p.m. on the dot every night for months. Tonight I pretended to swallow the pill and followed him into the darkness of our Manchester home. What I discovered shattered everything I thought I knew about the man I'd loved for 37 years. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I am Eleanor Rose Davies, 72 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed my marriage was just going through a difficult patch. I wore the same faded blue cardigan every morning, the one with tiny holes near the left elbow that I kept meaning to mend. My hands trembled as I made coffee in our Didsbury kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared thousands of breakfasts when love felt simple, and Sunday mornings stretched like promises. The routine had become my prison. Every evening at exactly 9 o'clock, Richard would appear with a small white pill and a glass of lukewarm water. "For your nerves, Eleanor, love," he'd say in that voice that had once whispered sweet nothings, but now carried the weight of impatience. The doctor said it would help with your anxiety, but I wasn't anxious before the pills started. I was just tired. Tired of being diminished. Tired of apologizing for taking up space in my own home. Tired of the way his eyes looked through me as if I were already gone. The pill made everything foggy. I'd wake up at noon feeling like I was swimming through thick honey, my thoughts scattered like autumn leaves swirling down Deansgate. Sometimes I'd find dishes I didn't remember washing, or discover I'd written checks I couldn't recall signing. Richard would pat my shoulder with false tenderness and remind me how forgetful I'd become. "It's your age, darling. These things happen." But tonight, when he handed me that familiar glass and pill, something inside me refused. Maybe it was the way the late October light filtered through our lace curtains, casting shadows that looked like prison bars across our hardwood floor. Maybe it was the smell of his cheap aftershave mixed with cigarette smoke that suddenly reminded me of everything I'd lost. I placed the pill under my tongue, pretended to swallow, and smiled the smile I'd perfected over decades of keeping the peace. "Good girl," he said, and those 2 words crawled under my skin like spiders. I waited in our bedroom, listening to his footsteps creak across the old Victorian floors. When I was sure he thought I was sleeping, I crept to the window and watched him leave through our back gate, something I'd never seen him do in all our years together. He carried a small leather briefcase I didn't recognize, and his movements were quick and secretive, like a man with something to hide. That's when I knew. Whatever was happening to me, whatever was stealing my memories and my strength, was deliberate. I found my old photo albums that night, the ones he'd moved to the basement claiming they were taking up too much space. There I was at 25, radiant in my wedding dress, holding his hand in front of Manchester Cathedral. My eyes sparkled with hope and dreams of growing old together with dignity and love. I traced my younger face with fingers that now bore age spots and arthritis, wondering when I'd stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror. The photos told a story of gradual erasure. In early pictures, I stood tall, my smile genuine and bright. By our 10th anniversary, my shoulders had begun to hunch slightly. By our 20th, my eyes held a cautious uncertainty. By our 30th, I looked like someone apologizing for existing. The progression was subtle but undeniable, like watching a flower wilt in slow motion. I had expected to age with grace beside the man I loved. Instead, I found myself trapped in shadows of my own making, complicit in my own disappearance. Let me tell you about the sacrifices I made, because I need you to understand how we got here. Maybe you'll recognize yourself in my story, or maybe you know someone who needs to hear this. When Richard lost his job at the insurance company 15 years ago, I sold my grandmother's pearl necklace to cover our mortgage. The pearls had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down with whispered stories of love and resilience. "It's just jewelry, Eleanor," Richard said when I hesitated. "Family is more important than trinkets." So I walked into that pawn shop in the northern quarter, my heart breaking with each step, and traded my heritage for his pride. When our son Liam needed money for his master's degree, I emptied my savings account from the small bookshop I'd run for 20 years. The reading nook had been my sanctuary, a place where elderly customers would linger over coffee and discuss their favorite novels. I knew every regular by name, remembered their preferences, celebrated their birthdays with special book recommendations. But Liam needed help, and Mother's sacrifice without question. I sold the business to a chain that gutted its soul and turned it into another generic coffee shop. "Mom, you didn't have to do that," Liam said when I told him, but his relief was palpable. He was drowning in student loans, and I was his life raft. What kind of mother would I be if I let him sink? When our daughter Sophie's marriage fell apart and she needed a place to stay with her 2 young children, I converted my sewing room into a nursery and spent my days caring for my grandchildren while she rebuilt her life. I loved those children fiercely, but Richard grew increasingly irritated by their noise and mess. "This house isn't a nursery school," he'd mutter, and I'd shush the children, apologize for their laughter, dim their natural joy to keep the peace. Each sacrifice felt righteous at the time. I was being a good wife, a good mother, a good grandmother, but with every piece of myself I gave away, I became smaller, quieter, more apologetic for taking up space in my own life. The day I collapsed in our kitchen 3 years ago, Sophie found me unconscious by the refrigerator. At the hospital, doctors said my blood pressure was dangerously low and I was severely dehydrated. Richard sat beside my bed looking concerned, but when the nurse asked about my medication, he answered before I could speak. "She's been having trouble remembering to take care of herself," he said with a sad smile. "It's been hard to watch. Even then, even lying in that hospital bed with IV tubes in my arm, I felt guilty for worrying everyone. I apologized to the nurses for being a bother, apologized to my children for scaring them, apologized to Richard for the hospital bills. The word sorry had become my most frequent utterance, worn smooth by constant use like a stone rubbed by countless hands. The microaggressions started so gradually I almost didn't notice them. Richard began commenting on my appearance with backhanded observations. "That dress makes you look wider than usual," he'd say while adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "Maybe try something less noticeable." When I'd cook his favorite roast beef dinner, he'd pick at it and mention how his colleague's wife made it better. "Not that yours is bad, Eleanor. It's just different." He stopped asking about my day or my opinions on the news. During dinner, he'd scroll through his phone while I tried to make conversation, responding with grunts or half-hearted mm-hms. When I suggested we take a weekend trip to the Lake District like we used to, he looked at me with genuine surprise. Why would we do that? We're too old for such nonsense. My birthday last year was a particularly cruel reminder of how invisible I'd become. I woke up expecting maybe a card or flowers, perhaps dinner at our old favorite restaurant in the city center. Instead, Richard had forgotten entirely. When I gently reminded him, he slapped his forehead theatrically. "Oh, Eleanor, I'm sorry. I'll pick something up tomorrow." Tomorrow came and went with no mention of my 72nd birthday. Our wedding anniversary was similarly ignored. The date we'd once celebrated with champagne and dancing now passed unmarked, unremarked upon, as if those years of shared history had never happened. I found myself grieving not just the absence of celebration, but the absence of acknowledgement that I had ever mattered at all. When I caught pneumonia this past winter, Richard seemed inconvenienced by my illness. I spent 3 days in bed with a fever, coughing so hard I couldn't sleep. He brought me water when I asked, but with visible frustration, as if caring for his sick wife was an unreasonable burden. When I asked him to pick up my prescription, he sighed heavily and made me feel guilty for needing medication to breathe. "Money's tight, Eleanor," he said when I mentioned the doctor recommended a humidifier. "We can't spend frivolously on every little thing." But I'd seen the credit card statements. I knew about his expensive lunches in town, his new golf clubs, his suddenly expanding wardrobe. Money was only tight when it came to my needs. The night I made the discovery that changed everything was February 14th, Valentine's Day. I'd hoped for some small gesture, some acknowledgement of the love we'd once shared. Instead, Richard announced he had to work late. I was organizing his desk drawer, looking for stamps to mail our council tax payment, when I found a stack of receipts rubber-banded together. The Beach's care home. Consultation fees, room deposits, monthly payment schedules. My hands trembled as I read through them, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The dates corresponded perfectly with his recent business trips and late nights at the office. He was planning to put me away. Without my knowledge, without my consent, he was arranging to have me committed to a care home. The paperwork included psychiatric evaluation requests and references to my increasing mental instability and inability to care for herself. Words I'd never heard from any doctor, symptoms I'd never exhibited, lies crafted to justify my removal from my own life. I dropped the delicate teacup I'd been holding, my grandmother's china that had survived the war shattering against our kitchen tiles. The sound was sharp and final, like the breaking of my last illusion about our marriage. Tears burned behind my eyes but refused to fall. I'd cried myself dry over the years, apparently. Standing there among the broken pieces, I caught my reflection in the microwave door. The woman staring back at me was hollow-eyed and defeated, her gray hair limp and lifeless, her posture curved inward as if trying to disappear. When had I become this ghost of myself? When had I allowed myself to be diminished to the point of erasure? For the first time in years, anger flickered in my chest. Not the quick flash of irritation I sometimes felt, but deep, righteous fury at what had been stolen from me. My voice, my choices, my dignity. My very sense of self had been eroded so gradually I hadn't realized I was drowning until I was already underwater. Could I fight back? Could I reclaim what was left of Eleanor Rose Davies? Could I say no to the pills, no to the diminishment, no to the slow destruction of my spirit? That night, I packed away our wedding photos, running my fingers over the faded lace of my dress in the pictures, remembering the woman who had once believed in happily ever after. I folded my wedding dress itself, stored in tissue paper for decades, and placed it in the bottom of an old trunk. Some chapters had to end before new ones could begin. But confronting decades of manipulation and control wouldn't be easy. The next morning, I decided to talk to Liam and Sophie about what I'd discovered. I needed my children to understand why I was questioning everything about our family dynamic. Liam arrived first, still wearing his suit from his job at the law firm in the city center. I'd always been proud of his success, proud that my sacrifices had helped him achieve his dreams. But when I showed him the care home receipts, his reaction was nothing like I'd expected. "Mum, maybe Dad's just being cautious," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You have been a little forgetful lately. And you did collapse last year. Maybe he's just planning for the future, just in case." "Just in case what, Liam? Just in case I become inconvenient? Just in case caring for me interferes with his comfort?" That's not what I meant. But his tone was defensive, uncertain. "Dad's been under a lot of stress lately. The economy, his health, watching you struggle with things." "What things exactly? What struggles are you seeing that I'm not aware of?" Liam shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the same chair where I'd helped him with homework for 12 years, where we'd had countless heart-to-heart talks about his dreams and fears. "Well, you do repeat yourself sometimes, and you seem confused about dates and appointments. Sophie mentioned you called her 3 times last week asking about the same thing." I felt the ground shifting beneath me, the same disorienting sensation the pills had been causing for months. Was I losing my memory? Was I really becoming the confused old woman they seemed to see? Or was this another layer of the manipulation, turning my own children against me by convincing them I was incompetent? When Sophie arrived an hour later, She hugged me with what felt like pity rather than affection. Her eyes held that look I'd seen from nurses and social workers, the professional sympathy reserved for difficult elderly patients. My daughter, my baby girl who used to crawl into my lap for comfort, was looking at me like I was already gone. "Mom, I think we need to talk about getting you some help," she said gently, as if speaking to a child. "Not a care home necessarily, but maybe someone to come in during the day, just to make sure you're taking your medications and eating properly. I take care of myself perfectly well, Sophie. I've been taking care of this entire family for decades. But you're older now, Mum. Things change. Dad showed me the shopping list you wrote last week where you wrote milk 4 times. And you left the hob on Tuesday night after making dinner. What if there had been a fire?" Each accusation felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. These weren't lies, exactly. But they weren't the full truth either. I had been forgetting things more often lately, feeling confused and disoriented. But now I knew why. The pills Richard gave me every night were stealing my clarity, my memory, my sense of self. My children couldn't see it because they trusted him more than they trusted my own account of my experience. "Have either of you considered that the pills your father gives me might be causing these problems?" I asked quietly. They exchanged a look, the kind of worried glance adult children share when their parent begins showing signs of paranoia or delusion. Sophie reached over and patted my hand condescendingly. "Mum, Dad wouldn't hurt you. He loves you. He's trying to help you manage your anxiety, just like the doctor prescribed." "What doctor? Do you know which doctor prescribed these pills? Do you know what they are or what they're supposed to do?" Another exchange of glances. They didn't know, I realized. They'd simply accepted Richard's word that I needed medication, that I was becoming unstable, that their mother was no longer capable of making decisions about her own life and health. The coup was complete. My husband had successfully convinced my children that I was incompetent, and now they were complicit in my diminishment. Not out of malice, but out of their own discomfort with my aging and their father's convincing performance as the long-suffering spouse of a difficult woman. Richard arrived home during our conversation, and the family meeting took on the atmosphere of an intervention. The 4 of us sat in our living room, the same room where we'd celebrated Christmas mornings and birthday parties, where we'd weathered storms and celebrated successes together. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was the defendant in a case I didn't understand. "Eleanor has been having some issues with memory and confusion," Richard said to our children, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine concern. "I've been trying to help her manage, but it's getting harder. She needs more care than I can provide while maintaining my job and handling all the household responsibilities." Household responsibilities? I still did all the cooking, most of the cleaning, managed our finances, and maintained our social calendar. What responsibilities had he taken on besides bringing me pills that made me forget my own life? "Dad, we appreciate how hard this must be for you," Sophie said, and I felt like I was watching my family through thick glass, unable to make them hear me. "What can we do to help?" "Actually," Richard said, pulling out a folder I recognized from his desk drawer, "I've been researching some options. There's a lovely facility called The Beaches that specializes in memory care. They have activities and professional staff who understand how to work with people in Eleanor's condition. My condition. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved." "I don't have a condition," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I have been drugged every night for months by a husband who has convinced all of you that I'm incompetent so you won't question his decisions about my life." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face showed hurt and bewilderment, a masterful performance of the devoted husband being accused by his mentally unstable wife. Liam looked uncomfortable, probably wishing he were anywhere else. Sophie's expression was pure pity, the look you might give a homeless person talking to invisible enemies. "Mum," Sophie said gently, "this is exactly what we're worried about. These paranoid thoughts, these accusations against Dad. This isn't like you." But it was like me, I wanted to scream. This was exactly like me. I had always questioned, always stood up for what was right, always fought for the people I loved. The woman who accepted diminishment and abuse wasn't me at all. She was a chemically induced shadow, a ghost created by months of systematic drugging and psychological manipulation. In the kitchen later that evening, while our children discussed my future like I wasn't capable of participating, my neighbor Aisha knocked on our back door. Aisha Khan had lived next door for 8 years, ever since her husband Tariq passed away from cancer. She was 75, sharp as a tack, and had been watching our family dynamics with increasingly concerned eyes. "Eleanor, love, could I borrow some sugar?" she asked, but her eyes were scanning my face with worry. "You look tired." Something about her genuine concern, so different from the pitying worry of my family, broke something open inside me. Without meaning to, I started crying for the first time in months. "Aisha, I think I'm losing my mind," I whispered, not wanting Richard to hear. "No, love, you're not losing anything, but someone is stealing from you." Her voice was quiet but fierce. "I've been watching. I see things. That husband of yours, he's got you convinced you're disappearing, but you're still here. You're still Eleanor Rose Davies. You just need to remember who she is." Aisha had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring. She knew the effects of medication, knew the signs of abuse, knew the difference between natural aging and induced incapacity. More importantly, she had survived her own difficult marriage and understood the subtle ways a partner could diminish you until you forgot your own worth. "What do I do?" I asked her. "My own children think I'm incompetent. They're planning to put me away. First thing, you stop taking whatever pills he's giving you. Second thing, you start keeping a journal of everything that happens, every conversation, every incident he claims you don't remember. Third thing, you remember that you are not powerless. You are not crazy. You are not too old to fight for your life." That night, when Richard brought me the familiar glass and pill, I made my first stand. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it, but my voice was steady. "No, thank you." He paused, the glass halfway to the night table, confusion flickering across his features. "What do you mean, no? You need this medication, Eleanor. The doctor was very specific about the dosage and timing." "Which doctor?" "I'd like to speak with him directly." "You know which doctor." "Dr. Evans. We discussed this already." But he was lying. I could see it in the way his eyes wouldn't meet mine, in the slight tremor in his hand holding the glass. I don't remember discussing anything with Dr. Evans about medication. In fact, I don't remember the last time I even saw Dr. Evans. "That's exactly why you need the medication. Eleanor, your memory is getting worse. You're becoming confused and agitated. This will help you sleep and reduce your anxiety." For 37 years, I had backed down from Richard's certainty, had doubted myself when my perceptions conflicted with his. But tonight, with Aisha's words echoing in my mind and my own righteous anger finally finding its voice, I held firm. I said no. My memory seems to be improving already. The look that crossed his face then was something I'd never seen before in our decades together. It wasn't concern or confusion. It was cold fury, the expression of someone whose control was being challenged. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw who my husband really was. "You're being unreasonable, Eleanor. Difficult. This is exactly the kind of behavior that concerns Liam and Sophie. Then they can be concerned. But I won't be drugged into compliance anymore." He left the room without another word, and for the first time in months, I slept naturally. No pharmaceutical fog, no lost hours, no waking up confused and disoriented. I slept the deep, restorative sleep of someone who has finally stopped swimming against the current. The next morning, I woke up clear-headed and energized in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The autumn sunlight streaming through our bedroom windows looked brighter, sharper, as if someone had cleaned a film from the glass. I could think in straight lines again, remember conversations and plans, feel like myself inhabiting my own body. I walked to Heaton Park alone, something I hadn't done in over a year. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. Along the paths, I watched joggers and dog walkers going about their morning routines, and I felt like I was rejoining the world of the living. Sitting on a bench, I pulled out the small notebook Aisha had given me and began writing down everything I could remember from the past few months. The gaps in my memory where whole days seemed to be missing. The conversations Richard claimed we'd had that I couldn't recall. The increasing frequency of his business trips and late nights. The gradual isolation from friends and activities I'd once enjoyed. A pattern emerged on paper that had been invisible while I was living through it. The systematic erosion of my independence, the careful documentation of my supposed incompetence, the methodical preparation for my removal from my own life. It was so calculated, so thorough, that I almost admired its cold efficiency. But I also realized how close I'd come to losing everything. A few more months of the pills, a few more incidents of confusion and forgetfulness, and the care home would have seemed like the only reasonable option to everyone involved, including, eventually, me. That afternoon, I called the law office Aisha had recommended. Judith Morris specialized in elder law and had seen cases like mine before. Her voice on the phone was warm but professional, and she didn't sound surprised by anything I told her. "Mrs. Davies, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than people realize. Elderly abuse often involves medication manipulation and psychological control. The good news is that if you're clear-headed enough to recognize what's happening and seek help, there are options available to you." We met the next day in her city center office, a warm space filled with family photos and legal books. Judith was my age, maybe a little younger, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She listened to my story without judgment or skepticism, taking careful notes and asking thoughtful questions. "First, we need to document your mental competence with an independent psychiatric evaluation. If someone has been claiming you're incompetent, we need medical proof that you're not. Second, we need to identify what medications you've been given and establish that they were administered without proper medical supervision. Third, we need to protect your assets and legal rights before anyone can act on the care home plans." She explained the legal process with patience and clarity, never talking down to me or treating me like a confused old woman who needed things simplified. For the first time in months, I felt like my intelligence and judgment were being respected rather than questioned. "Mrs. Davies, I want you to understand something important," she said as our meeting concluded. "Taking control of your life after decades of manipulation isn't just brave. It's your right. You don't need anyone's permission to refuse medication, to make your own medical decisions, or to live in your own home. Age doesn't make you incompetent, and marriage doesn't make you property." Walking out of her office, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not just for escape from a bad situation, but for the possibility of rediscovering who I was beneath all the years of diminishment. At 72, maybe it wasn't too late to become myself again. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected. Richard had noticed my increased clarity and independence, and it made him desperate. 3 days after I'd stopped taking the pills, he escalated his campaign to prove my incompetence. He called Liam and Sophie, telling them I was having a psychological crisis and had become paranoid and delusional. Bye. He claimed I was refusing necessary medication and might be a danger to myself or others. By the time they arrived at our house that evening, they were prepared for an emergency intervention. "Mum, Dad says you're refusing to take your anxiety medication," Sophie said, her voice tight with worry. "He's concerned about your judgment and your safety." "I'm concerned about them too," I replied. "My judgment has improved dramatically since I stopped being drugged every night, and I feel safer than I have in months." "See?" Richard said, spreading his hands in a gesture of helpless frustration. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. She's convinced I've been poisoning her or something equally ridiculous. She's completely lost touch with reality. Liam shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As a lawyer, he was trained to listen to evidence and ask questions, but as a son, he was caught between conflicting loyalties and his own discomfort with family drama. "Mum, can you help us understand what's been happening from your perspective?" he asked carefully. "Dad is worried about you, but you seem to have concerns about Dad. Maybe we can figure out what's really going on." It was the first time in months that anyone had asked for my perspective, rather than simply accepting Richard's version of events. I seized the opportunity to present the evidence I'd been gathering. The care home receipts, the timeline of my cognitive decline corresponding with the start of the pills, the lack of any legitimate medical consultation about my supposed anxiety medication. "Liam, you're a lawyer. Look at this documentation. Does this look like someone planning for my future care, or someone planning to have me committed without my knowledge or consent?" Liam examined the papers with professional attention, and I could see the moment when the legal implications became clear to him. His face grew serious as he read through the care home contracts and psychiatric evaluation requests. "Dad, this looks like you were planning to have Mum committed involuntarily. These forms request competency evaluations based on symptoms and incidents that aren't documented anywhere. Did you consult with her doctor about any of this?" Richard's composure began to crack under his son's questioning. The concerned husband facade faltered, revealing flashes of anger and frustration underneath. "She needs help, Liam. Professional help. I've been trying to manage her increasing confusion and paranoia, but it's beyond what I can handle at home. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions for people you love when they're no longer capable of making those decisions themselves." "But who determined that I'm not capable of making my own decisions?" I asked. "What doctor evaluated me and made that diagnosis? What medical tests or examinations led to the conclusion that I need to be medicated into compliance or institutionalized for my own good?" The silence that followed was telling. Sophie looked back and forth between her parents, beginning to understand that something was seriously wrong with the narrative she'd accepted. Liam's legal training was clearly engaged now, and he was asking the kinds of questions that exposed the holes in Richard's story. "Dad, I think we need to step back and approach this more carefully," Liam said finally. "If Mum needs medication or care, there are proper medical and legal procedures to follow. This looks like you've been making unilateral decisions about her healthcare and living situation without proper consultation or consent." "She's my wife," Richard said, and for the first time, his voice carried an edge of desperation. "I know her better than anyone. I can see what's happening to her even if she can't. Being someone's spouse doesn't give you the right to make medical decisions for them without their consent," Liam replied. "And it certainly doesn't give you the right to have them committed to a care home based on your unsupported opinions about their mental state." The family meeting that had started as an intervention for my delusions was turning into something very different. My children were beginning to see their father not as my devoted caregiver, but as someone who had been systematically undermining my autonomy and preparing to strip away my rights without due process. But Richard wasn't finished fighting. If legal manipulation wouldn't work, he was prepared to try emotional blackmail. Christmas arrived like a storm cloud on the horizon, heavy with the promise of family drama and forced togetherness. I'd been dreading the holiday for weeks, knowing it would be Richard's opportunity to rally the extended family to his version of events and paint me as an ungrateful, unstable wife who was breaking apart our family with paranoid accusations. Our dining room was decorated with the same festive colors we'd used for decades. The table set with my grandmother's china and crystal glasses that had survived the war. The irony wasn't lost on me that these family treasures would outlast the family that had treasured them. Sophie's children, my precious grandchildren, were excited about the holiday and oblivious to the adult tensions swirling around them. 8-year-old Olivia helped me arrange a holly centerpiece, chattering about her school nativity play and her new friend who collected rocks. 5-year-old Jack showed me his latest drawings, proud stick figure portraits of our family where everyone was smiling and holding hands. Looking at their innocent joy, I wondered what story they would eventually be told about their grandmother's disappearance from their lives. Would they remember me as the woman who read them bedtime stories and baked their favorite biscuits? Or would they learn to think of me as the confused old lady who became too difficult for the family to handle? Richard's sister Susan and her husband Peter arrived first, followed by my brother David and his wife Linda. The house filled with familiar voices and laughter, the sounds of a family gathering that should have brought comfort, but instead felt like a tribunal convening to judge my fitness for continued membership in my own life. During dinner preparation, I overheard Richard talking quietly to Susan in our kitchen, his voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of conversation about my deteriorating condition and the difficult position it was putting the family in. Susan's responses were sympathetic murmurs and worried questions about what would happen to me if Richard could no longer cope with my care needs. The narrative was spreading like a virus through our family network, each retelling adding new details about my incompetence and Richard's heroic patience. By the time we sat down to dinner, I could feel the subtle shift in how everyone was treating me. Their voices were a little louder and slower when they spoke to me, their smiles a little more forced and pitying, their attention a little more carefully managed as if I might say something embarrassing or inappropriate at any moment. But I had surprises of my own planned for this Christmas gathering. As we passed around the turkey and stuffing, making small talk about weather and children's school activities, I excused myself from the table and went to our bedroom. From my jewelry box, I retrieved our wedding photo, the formal portrait that had sat on our mantelpiece for 37 years. Richard and I looked so young, so hopeful, so certain that love would conquer whatever challenges lay ahead. I also gathered several other items: my marriage certificate, the deed to our house with both our names on it, and a folder containing bank statements and investment documents showing the retirement savings I'd contributed to over decades of working and careful money management. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation stopped. Something in my posture or expression had changed the atmosphere, shifting from a family dinner to something more serious and formal. "I want to show everyone something," I said, placing the wedding photo in the center of the table next to the turkey. "This is Richard and me on our wedding day, November 23rd, 1986. Look at my face in this picture. Do you see a weak woman? Do you see someone who lacks judgment or intelligence?" The family members exchanged glances, unsure where this was heading but sensing that the comfortable narrative they'd been told was about to be challenged. For 37 years, I honored the promises I made in this photograph. I loved, honored, cherished, and obeyed. I sacrificed my career, my savings, my independence, and eventually my sense of self to support this family and this marriage. I never questioned, never complained, never demanded anything for myself that might inconvenience anyone else. I picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time, memorizing the face of the young woman who had believed in happily ever after. Then, deliberately and ceremoniously, I tore it in half. The gasp from around the table was audible. Sophie reached out as if to stop me, but I held up my hand. "This marriage, as it has existed, is over. I will no longer accept being diminished, drugged, manipulated, or planned for like a problem to be solved. I will no longer apologize for taking up space in my own life or requiring basic respect and dignity from the people who claim to love me." Richard's face had gone white, then red, his hands clenched in his lap. "Eleanor, you're having an episode. This isn't appropriate in front of the children. What's not appropriate is a husband who drugs his wife without her consent and plans to have her committed to a care home without her knowledge. What's not appropriate is adult children who accept their father's word about their mother's competence without ever asking her directly about her own experiences. What's not appropriate is a family that has become complicit in the systematic abuse of one of its members. The silence around the table was deafening. Even the children had stopped eating, sensing that something important and scary was happening in the adult world that they didn't understand. David, my older brother, who had always been protective of me, leaned forward with concern. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? What husband drugs his wife?" "That's a serious accusation." I reached into my purse and pulled out the bottle of pills I'd collected from Richard's dresser drawer, the ones he'd been giving me every night for months. "These pills, David. No prescription label, no doctor's name, no instructions except Richard's word that they would help with my anxiety." Anxiety. I didn't have until I started taking medication that made me confused and forgetful and compliant. Liam, using his legal training, examined the bottle carefully. "Dad, where did these pills come from? There's no pharmacy label, no prescribing physician identified. You can't just give someone medication without proper medical supervision. She needed help." Richard exploded, his careful composure finally cracking completely. She was becoming impossible to live with, questioning everything, arguing about money, interfering with my decisions. These pills helped her relax and accept things more easily. I was trying to make our life together more peaceful. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. He had just confessed in front of our entire family to drugging me into submission because my natural personality and legitimate concerns were inconvenient for him. Susan looked horrified. "Richard, you can't drug someone because you don't like their personality. That's abuse." "It's not abuse, it's marriage management," he said, the mask slipping further to reveal something ugly underneath. Sometimes wives need help seeing things clearly, accepting their husband's judgment about what's best for the family. Linda, David's wife, who had been a social worker before retiring, spoke up with professional authority. "Richard, what you're describing is textbook spousal abuse. Medication manipulation is a form of domestic violence, and involuntary institutionalization based on fabricated incompetence is a crime." The family was turning against him now, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. But Richard wasn't finished. Desperate people do desperate things, and he was prepared to destroy me if he couldn't control me. "She's turning all of you against me," he said, his voice taking on a whining quality I'd never heard before. "Can't you see how manipulative she's being? Making me look like the villain when I've devoted my life to taking care of an increasingly difficult woman. She's not the same person I married. She's bitter and suspicious and impossible to please." "I'm exactly the same person you married," I said calmly. I just stopped pretending that being diminished was the same thing as being loved. Standing up from the table, I walked to our old wooden cabinet where we kept important documents. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out an envelope I'd hidden there the week before, after my meeting with Judith Morris. "I want everyone to know that I've consulted with a solicitor about my legal rights and options. I've had an independent psychiatric evaluation that confirms I'm completely competent to make my own decisions about my health care, living situation, and finances. Anyone who continues to treat me as if I'm incompetent will be dealing with legal consequences." The envelope contained copies of all the documentation Judith had helped me prepare: psychiatric evaluation results, photographs of the unlabeled medication, copies of the care home contracts Richard had signed without my knowledge, and bank records showing how he'd been gradually restricting my access to our joint accounts. I'm also serving notice that I will no longer tolerate being treated as if my value to this family is contingent on my willingness to be silent and compliant. I love all of you, but I will not sacrifice my dignity or my autonomy to purchase your comfort. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to be Richard's opportunity to rally family support for my institutionalization had become my declaration of independence. But I knew the war wasn't over. Desperate people fight dirty, and Richard still had weapons I hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks after Christmas, Richard launched his final attack. Since family pressure and legal manipulation hadn't worked, he decided to try public humiliation and social isolation. He created a Facebook post that went viral in our Manchester community group, painting himself as the devoted husband of an increasingly unstable wife whose paranoid delusions were tearing apart a loving family. The post was masterfully crafted, full of heartbreaking details about my supposed mental decline and his heroic efforts to care for me, despite my unwarranted suspicions and accusations. "Please keep us in your prayers," the post concluded. "Eleanor is not the woman I married, and watching someone you love disappear into mental illness is heartbreaking. I'm trying to get her the professional help she needs, but she's resistant to treatment and has convinced herself that everyone who loves her is conspiring against her." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors I'd known for decades left sympathetic comments about how difficult it must be to watch a spouse lose their mental faculties. Friends from my book club shared the post with their own stories about elderly relatives who had become paranoid and difficult. Church members offered prayers and casseroles and gentle suggestions about support groups for families dealing with dementia. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly with well-meaning calls from people who had seen the post and wanted to offer Richard their support and me their pity. Each conversation was excruciating, a careful dance around the assumption that I was mentally ill and Richard was a saint. The social isolation was swift and complete. Invitations to coffee mornings and book clubs stopped coming. When I went to the grocery shop or walked through the neighborhood, conversations would stop when people saw me, followed by worried whispers and sympathetic glances. I had become the neighborhood crazy lady, to be handled with kid gloves and discussed in hushed, pitying tones. But this time, instead of crumbling under the social pressure or doubting my own perceptions, I felt a cold fury that burned clean and bright. Richard had miscalculated. By making our private battle public, he had given me an opportunity to tell my side of the story to an audience I hadn't had access to before. I spent 3 days crafting my own Facebook response, working with Judith Morris to ensure that everything I said was legally accurate and defensible. When I posted it, I included photographs of the unlabeled medication, copies of my psychiatric evaluation results, and scanned images of the care home contracts. My husband posted about my supposed mental illness without my knowledge or consent, I wrote. "I want our community to know the truth about what has been happening in our marriage. I have been systematically drugged, manipulated, and prepared for involuntary commitment to a care home, all without proper medical consultation or legal documentation. I have been evaluated by independent medical professionals who confirm that I am mentally competent and have been the victim of spousal abuse, not mental illness." The response to my post was even more dramatic than the response to Richard's. Comments flooded in from women sharing their own stories of husbands who had tried to control them through medication, isolation, and manipulation of family members. Neighbors began reaching out to apologize for accepting Richard's version of events without hearing mine. Several people mentioned that they had always felt something was off about how Richard spoke about me, but hadn't wanted to get involved in what they assumed was a private family matter. The tide of public opinion shifted rapidly and decisively. Richard went from being seen as a long-suffering husband to being viewed as an abusive spouse who had been caught trying to destroy his wife's reputation to cover his own crimes. The social media battle that he thought would isolate and discredit me instead exposed him to the judgment and condemnation of our entire community. But the most important victory wasn't social or legal. It was personal. For the first time in decades, I had defended myself publicly and uncompromisingly. I had refused to accept being diminished, even when the cost of fighting back was social disapproval and family conflict. I had chosen dignity over peace, truth over comfort, self-respect over the approval of people who would rather believe a lie than confront an uncomfortable reality. Standing in my kitchen the morning after my Facebook post went viral, reading through messages of support from friends I thought I'd lost and strangers who recognized my story as their own, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride. Not the quiet satisfaction of being a good wife and mother, but the fierce pride of being a strong woman who had refused to disappear without a fight. The transformation wasn't just internal. Looking in my bathroom mirror that morning, I saw changes that went beyond psychology. My posture was straighter, my eyes brighter, my expression more alert and confident. The gray pallor that had settled over my skin during the months of drugged compliance was giving way to a healthier color. I looked like someone who was inhabiting her own life, rather than merely surviving it. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I called a travel agent and booked a trip to visit my university roommate in the south of France. Brenda and I had kept in touch over the years, but hadn't seen each other in person for over a decade. She had invited me many times to visit her villa near Nice, but I had always declined, citing Richard's work schedule or family obligations or the expense of traveling. "Eleanor Rose Davies? Is that really you?" Brenda's voice on the phone was warm with delight and surprise. "I saw your Facebook post, love. Good for you for fighting back. When can you come? I'll clear my calendar for as long as you want to stay." Making travel arrangements, packing a suitcase, imagining myself in a different landscape surrounded by art and friendship and conversation that didn't revolve around my supposed incompetence felt like the most revolutionary act of my life. For 72 years, I had defined myself in relation to other people's needs and expectations. For the first time, I was making plans based solely on what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be. Richard was furious about the trip, of course. He accused me of running away from our problems, abandoning my responsibilities, and spending money frivolously on unnecessary luxuries. But his words had lost their power over me. I could see them now for what they were. Attempts to control me through guilt and manipulation rather than legitimate concerns about my choices. "I'm not running away from anything, Richard," I said as I folded warm-weather clothing into my suitcase. "I'm walking toward something. There's a difference. What about me? What about our marriage? Are you just going to abandon everything we've built together?" What we built together was a relationship where I gave up everything, and you gave up nothing. What I'm abandoning is my participation in my own diminishment. The marriage ended the day you decided to drug me into compliance rather than respect me as an equal partner. He tried several more tactics, threatening divorce, claiming financial hardship, suggesting that traveling alone at my age was dangerous and irresponsible. But each argument only reinforced my decision to leave. A man who truly loved me would have been excited about my opportunity for friendship and adventure, not threatened by my independence and joy. The flight to Nice was my first time traveling alone in over 30 years. Sitting by the aeroplane window, watching Manchester disappear beneath the clouds, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with altitude. I was literally and figuratively rising above the circumstances that had defined my life for so long. Brenda met me at the airport with a smile that could have powered the city. She looked healthy and vibrant at 73, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob, her colorful jewelry bright against her tan skin. This was what 70-something could look like when you weren't spending your energy fighting for basic dignity and respect. "You look tired, love," she said as we drove through the rolling hills toward her villa. "But you also look like you're waking up." I can see the Eleanor I knew at university starting to shine through again. Her house was a revelation, walls covered with art she had collected or created herself, bookshelves filled with volumes that showed evidence of being read and reread, a garden where she grew enough vegetables to feed herself and share with neighbors. Every room reflected her personality and interests, a stark contrast to my Manchester home where my preferences had been gradually subsumed into Richard's vision of appropriate domesticity. "This is what it looks like when you get to make your own choices about how you want to live," Brenda said, showing me the guest room where I would be staying. After Harold died 10 years ago, I realized I had spent 40 years of marriage compromising my tastes to match his. It took me 3 years to figure out what colors I actually liked, what kind of furniture made me comfortable, even what foods I enjoyed eating when I didn't have to consider anyone else's preferences. We stayed up late that first night, talking like the university girls we used to be. Brenda told me about her journey from corporate wife to independent woman, the mistakes she'd made along the way, the loneliness she'd had to endure to maintain her freedom and dignity. I told her about the pills, the care home plans, the systematic erosion of my identity, and the recent battle to reclaim my life. The hardest part, she said as we sat on her terrace watching stars emerge in the clear night sky, was learning to trust my own judgment again. When someone spends years telling you that your thoughts and feelings are wrong or unreasonable or symptoms of illness, you start to doubt everything about yourself. Getting back to a place where you can make decisions based on your own values and desires rather than fear of disapproval is like learning to walk again after a long illness. I spent 2 weeks in France, hiking in the hills, visiting art galleries, attending lectures at the local community center, cooking meals from fresh ingredients we bought at the farmer's market. Most importantly, I remembered what it felt like to wake up each morning with anticipation rather than dread, to make plans based on interest rather than obligation, to have conversations that challenged and stimulated my mind rather than requiring me to perform grateful compliance. Brenda introduced me to her circle of friends, women in their 60s and 70s who had created rich, full lives for themselves regardless of their marital status or family circumstances. Some were widows like Brenda, some were divorced, some had never married, and some were in marriages that enhanced rather than diminished their independence. What they all had in common was a refusal to apologize for taking up space in the world or requiring respect as a condition of relationship. Age gives us permission to stop pretending, said Elena, a sculptor in her 80s who had left her controlling husband at the age of 75. We're too old to waste time on people who don't appreciate us, too wise to believe that being alone is worse than being diminished, too experienced to accept less than we deserve from the people who claim to love us. When it was time to return to Manchester, I almost couldn't bear the thought of leaving this community of strong, creative, unapologetic women. But I knew I needed to go home and face whatever came next with Richard and my family. I also knew that I was returning as a different person than the one who had left 2 weeks earlier. The difference wasn't just internal. I had bought new clothes in France, bright colors that flattered my skin and made me feel vibrant rather than invisible. I had my hair cut and styled by Brenda's hairdresser, a shorter, more modern style that framed my face and made my eyes look brighter. Most importantly, I carried myself differently, with the confidence of someone who had remembered her own worth. Richard was waiting for me at Manchester Airport, and I could see the shock in his eyes when he recognized me walking toward him. This wasn't the diminished, apologetic woman he had been systematically destroying for the past several years. This was someone who looked like she enjoyed her own company and didn't need his approval to feel valuable. "You look different," he said as we drove home through Manchester traffic. It wasn't a compliment or a criticism, just an observation that clearly unsettled him. "I feel different," I replied. I remembered what it's like to make choices based on what makes me happy rather than what makes other people comfortable. The house felt smaller when we walked through the front door, as if my expanded sense of self couldn't quite fit into the space where I had been systematically shrinking for so many years. The rooms that had once felt like home now felt like a museum of a life I no longer wanted to live, filled with furniture and decorations chosen to please someone else's aesthetic rather than my own. That evening, as we sat in our living room making awkward conversation about my trip, Richard made one final attempt to reassert control over our relationship. "I hope you got this wanderlust out of your system, Eleanor. I was thinking while you were gone that maybe we should consider selling the house and moving into one of those retirement villages where there are more services and support systems. At our age, it's important to be realistic about our limitations and plan for the future." I looked at him carefully. This man I had loved and obeyed and feared for so many years. He was still handsome at 75, his silver hair thick and well-groomed, his posture straight despite his age. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was testing my resolve and looking for signs that my independence was just a temporary rebellion that could be managed and contained. "Richard," I said quietly, "I need you to understand something very clearly. I have no limitations that I haven't accepted voluntarily, and I will not be planning a future that requires me to diminish myself for your comfort. If you want to live in a retirement village, you're free to make that choice for yourself. But you will not be making it for me. The conversation that followed was our most honest in decades, though honesty turned out to be more destructive than the polite lies we had been telling ourselves and each other for years. Richard admitted that he had found my increasing independence and assertiveness threatening, that he had preferred me medicated and compliant because it made our life together more predictable and manageable. He couldn't understand why I wasn't grateful for his willingness to make difficult decisions on my behalf, why I insisted on complicating our comfortable routine with demands for respect and autonomy. "I don't know who you are anymore, Eleanor," he said finally. "You're not the woman I married." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "I'm the woman that woman was supposed to become if she hadn't spent 37 years trying to be the person you wanted instead of the person she actually was." By spring, we were living separate lives in the same house while solicitors worked out the details of our divorce. It was a sad and complicated process, made more difficult by our age and the length of our marriage, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions about my future without having to consider anyone else's preferences or convenience. I kept the house, partly because I had contributed significantly to the down payment and mortgage payments over the years, but mostly because I needed a space where I could practice being myself without audience or judgment. Richard moved to a luxury retirement flat on the other side of town, where he quickly established a new routine and began telling neighbors about his unfortunate marriage to a woman who had become increasingly unreasonable and demanding in her old age. Liam and Sophie struggled to adjust to the new dynamic between their parents, caught between loyalty to their father and growing recognition that their mother had legitimate grievances about how she had been treated. Our relationships were strained, but not broken, slowly healing as they began to see me as a person with my own needs and desires rather than just their father's wife and their children's grandmother. The most unexpected gift of my transformation was the relationship I developed with Aisha, my neighbor who had become my closest friend and strongest supporter. We discovered that we had complementary skills and interests. She was an excellent cook while I was a gifted gardener. She loved organizing while I enjoyed cleaning. She was practical with DIY while I was good with finances and paperwork. More importantly, we understood each other's journey from diminishment to empowerment. Aisha had survived her own difficult marriage and the process of rebuilding her identity after her husband's death. She could recognize the signs of someone learning to trust her own judgment again, someone practicing the unfamiliar art of putting her own needs first occasionally. Together, we created a life that was rich with friendship, creativity, and mutual support. We took classes at the community college, traveled to places we had always wanted to see, volunteered with organizations that helped elderly people navigate legal and medical systems designed to ignore or exploit them. We discovered that independence didn't have to mean isolation, that choosing to be alone was very different from being abandoned or unwanted. On my 73rd birthday, I threw myself a party. Not a family obligation disguised as a celebration, not a milestone to be endured with appropriate gratitude, but a genuine party to celebrate the fact that I had survived long enough to finally become myself. The guest list included Brenda, who flew in from France, Aisha and several of her friends, women from my book club who had rallied around me during the divorce, and neighbors who had supported me through the social media battles with Richard. Missing were my children, who were still struggling to accept the new version of their mother, and obviously Richard, who was no longer part of my story except as a cautionary tale about the cost of accepting diminishment as the price of love. The party was held in my back garden, which I had transformed into a space that reflected my own tastes, rather than some imagined standard of suburban propriety. Vegetables and flowers grew together in happy profusion. Wind chimes made gentle music in the afternoon breeze, and fairy lights cast a warm glow as the sun set behind the Manchester skyline. Standing in my garden, surrounded by women who valued and respected me for who I was rather than how well I served their needs, I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. The journey from systematic diminishment to joyful independence had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had also been necessary and ultimately liberating. Before my guests left that evening, I made a short speech that I had been thinking about for weeks. "A year ago, I was disappearing," I began. "Someone who claimed to love me was systematically erasing my memories, my judgment, my autonomy, and ultimately my sense of self. I was so close to being completely gone that I almost didn't recognize the danger until it was too late." The women around me nodded with recognition. Too many of them had their own stories of partners or family members who had tried to diminish them, control them, or convince them that their own perceptions and desires were symptoms of illness or selfishness rather than expressions of legitimate selfhood. But I want you to know that it's never too late to come back to yourself. It's never too late to say no to people who claim that loving them requires you to disappear. It's never too late to choose dignity over peace, authenticity over approval, self-respect over the comfort of others. I raised a glass of the wine Brenda had brought from France, a bottle from a vineyard owned by women who had started their business in their 60s and 70s. Here's to survival, to resistance, to the courage it takes to become yourself at any age. Here's to the women who refuse to apologize for taking up space in the world. Here's to all of us who have learned that being alone is infinitely preferable to being diminished by people who are supposed to love us. The toast that followed was loud and enthusiastic, a celebration not just of my birthday, but of all our various journeys towards self-respect and independence. Later, as I cleared up glasses and plates in my kitchen, I reflected on how different this celebration was from the birthday Richard had forgotten the year before. This wasn't a party thrown for me by people who felt obligated to acknowledge my existence. This was a party I had thrown for myself and the friends who genuinely enjoyed my company. 6 months later, I received an unexpected phone call from Olivia, my 8-year-old granddaughter. Sophie had been slowly warming to the idea that her mother might have legitimate reasons for divorce, and she had apparently decided that her children deserved to know their grandmother, as she actually was, rather than as Richard had portrayed her. "Grandma Eleanor, Mummy says you live by yourself now and you have a really cool garden," Olivia said in that direct way that children approach complicated adult situations. "Can I come see it sometime? I'm learning about vegetables in school, and I want to know how you make them grow." That phone call was the beginning of a new relationship with my grandchildren, one based on mutual interest and affection rather than obligation and performance. Olivia loved helping me plant seeds and harvest vegetables, learning about the magic of growth and change that happens when you provide the right conditions and then trust the natural process. Jack enjoyed the wind chimes and bird feeders, spending quiet hours observing the wildlife that visited our urban oasis. Most importantly, they got to know me as a person with interests, opinions, and stories of my own, rather than just as the grandmother who was expected to bake biscuits and provide unconditional approval of their parents' decisions. They learned that their grandmother was someone who had traveled to different places, read interesting books, and made choices about how she wanted to live her life. "Grandma, why did you and Grandpa get divorced?" Olivia asked one afternoon as we were weeding the tomato plants together. "Because we wanted different things," I answered honestly. "I wanted to be treated with respect and make my own decisions about my life. He wanted me to do whatever he thought was best without questioning him. Those two things couldn't exist in the same marriage." "But don't people who love each other want each other to be happy?" she asked with the logical clarity that children bring to complex situations. "Yes, they do." And that's how I knew he didn't really love me the way I needed to be loved. These conversations with my grandchildren were some of the most meaningful of my new life. They reminded me that authenticity is a gift we give not just to ourselves, but to the people around us, especially the children who are learning what healthy relationships look like by watching the adults in their lives. A year after my divorce was finalized, I received another unexpected communication, this time from Richard himself. He had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and apparently the diagnosis had triggered some self-reflection about his behavior during our marriage. The letter was handwritten, which surprised me. Richard had always preferred email or text messages for efficiency and emotional distance. His handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but the words were clear and, for the first time in decades, honest. "Eleanor," he wrote, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you something before my mind gets worse, and I lose the ability to think clearly about what happened between us. The doctors say that sometimes people with my condition become more honest about things they've been hiding or denying, and I think that's happening to me now." The letter went on to acknowledge, directly and without excuses, that he had systematically manipulated and controlled me during our marriage. He admitted to giving me medication without proper medical supervision, planning to have me committed without my knowledge or consent, and deliberately undermining my confidence and independence because my strength and autonomy threatened his sense of control. "I told myself I was taking care of you, but I know now that I was really just taking care of myself," he wrote. "I was afraid of getting old and becoming irrelevant, so I made you smaller to make myself feel bigger. I was afraid of being alone, so I made sure you were too weak to leave me. I was afraid you would realize you deserved better, so I convinced you that you were lucky anyone would put up with you at all." The letter was both an apology and a confession, an admission of guilt that came too late to repair our relationship, but not too late to provide a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. "I don't expect forgiveness," he concluded, "and I'm not asking you to come back or take care of me as my condition gets worse. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did to you, and I'm sorry. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. I hope you found that better life without me." I read the letter several times that evening, sitting in my garden as the sun set behind the city skyline. My initial reaction was anger at the fact that it had taken a medical diagnosis for Richard to admit what he had done to me. But gradually, the anger gave way to something more complex, a mixture of sadness for the marriage we might have had if he had been capable of loving me without needing to control me, relief that my perceptions of his behavior had been accurate all along, and gratitude that I had found the strength to leave before his illness made me feel obligated to stay and care for him. I never responded to the letter. There was nothing I needed to say to Richard that would benefit either of us. The apology was his gift to himself, a way of clearing his conscience before his mind lost the ability to distinguish between truth and fiction. My gift to myself was the recognition that I didn't owe him forgiveness, gratitude, or care simply because he had finally acknowledged his wrongs. Instead, I focused on the life I was building for myself, the friendships and interests and adventures that filled my days with purpose and joy. I had learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between being alone and being abandoned, between independence and isolation. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about what I needed and deserved from the people in my life. 2 years after my divorce, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I sold our family home and moved to a smaller place that reflected my own tastes and needs rather than someone else's vision of appropriate living. The new house was a cozy bungalow in Chorlton, with hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a compact back garden perfect for the intensive gardening that had become my passion. The moving process was emotionally complicated, requiring me to sort through decades of accumulated possessions and decide what belonged in my new life versus what had only existed to support relationships and routines that no longer served me. I donated boxes of china and crystal that I had never liked, but had felt obligated to maintain, gave away furniture that was too large or formal for my new space, and sold household items that had been chosen for their appropriateness rather than their beauty or functionality. Most challenging was deciding what to do with the photographs and mementos from my marriage and my children's childhood. Some memories were too precious to discard despite their complicated associations. Pictures of Liam and Sophie as babies, holiday photos from the few trips where we had genuinely enjoyed each other's company, gifts from my children that reflected their love rather than their father's expectations of appropriate family dynamics. But other items had to go. The formal family portraits where my smile looked increasingly strained over the years. The anniversary gifts that had been chosen to demonstrate Richard's generosity rather than his knowledge of my preferences. The household decorations that had been selected to impress visitors rather than to make me feel comfortable in my own home. The process of physically removing these objects from my life was surprisingly liberating. Each box donated or discarded felt like another weight lifted from my shoulders. Another step toward creating a living space that supported my authentic self, rather than a performance of someone else's idea of who I should be. Moving day itself was a celebration, rather than a trauma. Aisha organized a group of friends to help with packing and transporting, turning what could have been a sad milestone into a community event. Brenda flew in from France to help me arrange furniture in my new space, bringing bright textiles and art that immediately made the house feel like home. "This is what freedom looks like," she said, as we arranged books on my new built-in shelves, mixing novels and poetry with cookbooks and gardening guides according to my own logic, rather than any imposed system of organization. A space that reflects your actual interests and values, rather than what you think other people expect from you. That first night in my new house, I sat in my compact but well-designed kitchen, drinking tea from a mug I had chosen for its perfect weight and feel in my hands, looking out at a garden that would soon bloom with vegetables and flowers selected for my own pleasure rather than their appropriateness for the neighborhood aesthetic. The silence was profound and peaceful, broken only by the gentle sounds of my own breathing and the distant hum of city life beyond my windows. For the first time in my adult life, I was living in a space that was entirely my own, decorated with objects that brought me joy, organized according to my own preferences and habits, maintained for my own comfort rather than someone else's approval. It was a small house, much smaller than the family home I had left, but it felt infinitely larger because every corner of it belonged to me. The loneliness I had feared would accompany living alone never materialized. Instead, I discovered the profound pleasure of solitude, the luxury of making decisions based solely on my own desires and schedules. I could eat dinner at 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock depending on my appetite, read until 2 in the morning without worrying about disturbing anyone, play music that I enjoyed without considering whether it might annoy someone else. More importantly, the friends who visited my new house came because they wanted to see me, not because they felt obligated to maintain family relationships or social appearances. My living room became a gathering place for book club meetings, garden planning sessions, and long conversations about politics, art, travel, and the complex experience of aging as a woman in a culture that often treats elderly women as invisible or burdensome. "You know what I love most about coming here?" Aisha asked one evening as we sat on my back patio, sharing a bottle of wine and watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "I love that you're genuinely glad to see me when I arrive, and you're not secretly relieved when I leave. So many of the social interactions we have at our age are based on obligation or loneliness rather than genuine pleasure in each other's company." She was right. The relationships in my new life were cleaner, more authentic, based on mutual interest and affection rather than complicated histories of obligation and resentment. I had learned to distinguish between people who enhanced my life and people who drained my energy, between friends who valued me for who I was and acquaintances who only appreciated what I could do for them. This clarity extended to my relationship with my children as well. Liam and Sophie gradually came to understand that their mother's transformation wasn't a rejection of them, but a rejection of a family dynamic that had required her to minimize herself for everyone else's comfort. As I became more authentic and assertive in our interactions, they began to relate to me as a person, rather than just as a source of unconditional support and approval. "I think I like you better now, Mum," Sophie said during one of our regular phone calls, a comment that was both amusing and poignant. "You're more interesting to talk to when you have opinions and preferences. I didn't realize how much I missed having real conversations with you instead of just checking in to make sure you were okay and didn't need anything." These improved relationships with my adult children were one of the unexpected gifts of my transformation. By refusing to continue playing the role of the self-sacrificing mother who existed primarily to serve their needs, I had opened space for us to develop genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests. They were more likely to ask for my advice now that they knew I would give honest answers, rather than just telling them what I thought they wanted to hear. The third anniversary of my divorce fell on a crisp October day, the kind of Manchester autumn afternoon that makes the city feel like the most beautiful place on earth. I spent the day in my garden, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes and peppers, preparing my flower beds for winter, and planning next year's plantings. As I worked with my hands in the soil, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment and self-possession. 3 years earlier, I had been a ghost of myself, drugged into compliance, and prepared for institutional care by a husband who preferred me diminished rather than equal. I had been isolated from friends, estranged from my own desires and opinions, convinced that my value was contingent on my willingness to disappear for other people's convenience. Now, at 75, I was more fully myself than I had ever been. I had opinions about books and politics and art that I expressed freely and defended confidently. I had friendships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and convenience. I had a living space that reflected my own aesthetic and supported my own routines. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about what I needed and deserved from the people in my life. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. There had been moments of loneliness when I missed the illusion of security that came with being part of a couple, even a dysfunctional couple. There had been times when I doubted my own strength and wondered if I was being unreasonably demanding in my insistence on dignity and respect. There had been family gatherings where I felt like an outsider, social situations where my independence was treated as evidence of selfishness or inability to compromise. But there had also been mornings when I woke up excited about the day ahead, evenings when I fell asleep satisfied with how I had spent my time, conversations that challenged and stimulated my mind, adventures that expanded my understanding of what was possible for a woman my age. There had been the deep satisfaction of making choices based on my own values rather than fear of disapproval, the peace that comes from knowing that I was living authentically rather than performing for an audience. Most importantly, there had been the growing recognition that it was never too late to become yourself, never too late to refuse diminishment, never too late to insist on being treated with the respect that all human beings deserve regardless of their age, gender, or relationship status. That evening, as I sat in my living room reading a book Brenda had recommended about women who had made significant life changes in their 70s and 80s, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was from a woman named Carol who had read about my story in a local blog article about elderly divorce and domestic violence. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know that your story has given me courage to leave my own difficult marriage. I'm 68 and have been married for 43 years to a man who has convinced me and everyone else that I'm incompetent and unreasonable. Reading about your experience helped me realize that I'm not crazy or ungrateful, just trapped in a situation that requires me to disappear in order to keep the peace. I wanted to thank you for being brave enough to fight back and share your story. It's helping other women realize they're not alone." Messages like Carol's had been arriving regularly since my story became known in Manchester circles focused on elderly rights and domestic violence prevention. Each one was a reminder that my experience wasn't unique, that there were countless other women my age who were being systematically diminished by partners who claimed to love them but actually feared their strength and independence. Some of these women found the courage to leave their situations and rebuild their lives. Others weren't ready for such a dramatic change, but were able to set boundaries and demand better treatment within their existing relationships. A few simply found comfort in knowing that their experiences were valid and that their desire for dignity and respect wasn't unreasonable or selfish. I had never intended to become a spokesperson for elderly women's rights, But I discovered that there was power in sharing my story honestly and without shame. Too often, women my own age were told that we should be grateful for any attention or care, that we should accept diminishment as a natural part of aging, that we should prioritize family harmony over our own well-being and autonomy. By refusing to accept those messages, and by speaking publicly about the cost of compliance, I had apparently given other women permission to examine their own relationships and consider whether they were truly being loved or simply being managed and controlled. The most important thing I learned, I told Carol when she called me a few weeks later, having finally decided to leave her own abusive marriage, is that being alone is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Being erased while surrounded by people who claim to love you is much worse. Loneliness is temporary and can be addressed by building new relationships. Disappearing into someone else's vision of who you should be is a kind of death that no one should accept at any age. Now, as I come to the end of this story, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing in your own life? Have you ever found yourself apologizing for taking up space, minimizing your own needs and desires to keep peace with people who claim to love you? Have you ever wondered if the person you've become bears any resemblance to the person you once were, or the person you dreamed of becoming? If any part of my story feels familiar, I want you to know that it's never too late to come back to yourself. It's never too late to say no to people who require your diminishment as proof of your love. It's never too late to choose dignity over peace, authenticity over approval, self-respect over the comfort of others. You don't have to accept being diminished. You don't have to apologize for aging, for having opinions, for taking up space in the world. You don't have to buy love with your disappearance or purchase belonging with your silence. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you lived through something similar, or do you know someone who has? Your story might be exactly what another person needs to hear to find their own courage. If this story touched your heart or gave you something to think about, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. When we share these experiences, we help each other remember that we're not alone and that it's never too late to reclaim our lives and our dignity. Together, we can help other people find the strength to refuse diminishment and choose themselves, regardless of their age or circumstances. Thank you for listening to my story. May you find the courage to live your own.